Hello and welcome to Thinking Critically, a D&D discussion, a podcast where we deep dive single word concepts or ideas within the Dungeons & Dragons 5e framework. My name is Danilo, and I like all kinds of games and the crunchy mechanics that make them tick. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and I'd really appreciate a like or a follow. Today's topic is Homebrew, and I'm joined by Kyle Wagner-Totty, aka Mr. Bakudan. Thank you ever so much for joining us, Kyle. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Kyle Wagner-Totty. I'm 29 years old, and I have been playing Dungeons & Dragons since mid-high school, so about 2014, I believe. I've published a couple of things on DM's Guild. I'm up to about 7 products right now. And I honestly have been homebrewing essentially my entire Dungeons & Dragons career.
Wow, that's a lot of homebrew in that case. Which it means that you are the expert, you're the perfect person to have on for today's topic of homebrew. So with that in mind, what does that word mean to you at its highest level within the D&D 5e, or just the D&D framework?
So, I actually started with Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, and I didn't even know anything about, like, Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance or anything like that. The very first setting I was ever introduced to was a homebrew setting, so I just assumed that's just the way that Dungeons & Dragons is played. You just make up everything. So, essentially, for me, what homebrewing is that it is the custom creation and modifying of using the set rule sets within Dungeons & Dragons to create what you want or you feel like Dungeons & Dragons needs. For example, I don't like the limited number of magic items within 5th edition, so I just brought all of 4th edition into 5th.
I had a look at those, and yep, by golly, that is a large number of items you brought across. So why don't we start there then? Can you tell us a little bit about the process behind that? I imagine there's got to be some kind of translation that has to happen between 4th edition and 5th edition. And, full disclosure, my experience is unfortunately limited to 5th edition. So please educate me on that process.
Oh yeah, that's totally fine. 4th edition was more of a wargaming kind of edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Like, you had a lot of customization regarding magic items, and there were tons of classes and races, and every class basically had, like, their own customization regarding, like, they each had their own spell lists, essentially, like even warriors. And,
Wow.
Essentially, the magic items were basically like an MMORPG, where you just had tons and tons and tons of different types of magic items. And the conversion process, I believe there's a conversion document that was first released with 5th edition. Like, when you wanted to convert 4th edition into 5th, they gave you a document to help you with that, and that helped out about a lot. But mostly it was just, like, some of the things in 4th edition just don't directly translate into 5th. So you kind of have to keep the spirit of the item, essentially, while also making it balanced and workable within 5th edition itself.
Yeah, that keeping the spirit of the item or the design intent. Like, I know what this item is meant to do, the ideal of what this item is meant to do. So translating that across, I imagine some things are going to have to fall by the wayside if there's no direct translation. Just like in human languages, sometimes there's not one single word to translate an idea or a concept. From what I've seen, it's an impressive volume, and of course my knowledge of your homebrew is limited to the item vault, to the 4E translations. So how did that realization come to you, I suppose, of, hey, I'm starting to play 5e, oh my gosh, there's not enough items here. Is that literally how it went, or was there more to it than that?
So a funny thing happening at my workplace was that there was a lot of time in between times I would work, so I'd literally have nothing to do. So before I even started getting into 5th edition, I just started running a 4th edition campaign with my coworkers. And then they were like, this is kind of complex. And I had seen 5th edition books, and I thought, I don't like the art. I'm going back to 4th. Yeah. That was funny. But I decided to take a second look at 5th, and I'm like, okay, I really like this now. I've seen the rule sets. It's way simpler. My players will probably like it more. But there's really not a lot of magic items. So because I had so much time in between my work, I was literally bringing my 4th edition books with me to work. And in between work, I was converting those items into 5th edition. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even have intentions of publishing it. It was just like, this is something I can do while I'm waiting for work.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad you did have that change of heart, because I'm looking forward to getting my teeth into some of those. I like having more options, although I must admit that I use D&D Beyond to filter down and search for some items, and sometimes there can be a lot there, but I'm always up for variety and having all sorts of different choices. And I think one of the huge benefits I like of Homebrew is catching players who might be potentially a little bit more knowledgeable around, the rule book and items and monsters, and I know this is a basilisk, so don't look it in the eye, that kind of thing. Catching them off guard with random items that they've never ever seen before is something I relish a lot. And likewise with creatures. So that's a good point you brought up there of when you started, you didn't intend for that to be published. It was just a personal project. Do you think there's a difference between designing Homebrew for the public and for private use, for lack of a better term?
I would definitely say there is. When you're designing something for a product that can be sold, you typically want to have a couple of more sets of eyes on it. Like, I have an editor, and that editor is godsend because they give me mechanic advice, and they edit my terrible English writing. I use way too many commas, but essentially, it's good to have a second set of eyes on a balance for people are more likely to purchase a product or like a product if it's well balanced and it's well reviewed, compared to just introducing something in a personal game. You can get away with a little bit more craziness and some less review, basically, like less balance. Because you can just balance it mid-game.
On the fly, yeah. Which is something I do with the non-Homebrew creatures enough, so... Okay, you're going to have to give me the details of your editor then, because I'm going to need some assistance at some point. So yeah, I'm in a somewhat of a similar position. So my D&D experience, I started as a player, and I really threw myself into the mechanics, into the rules. I'm a bit of an obsessive personality in that respect. So the bridge between player and DM was a very short one. And also I can be creative, not artistically, I can't draw anything ever, but in terms of creating worlds, that was very attractive to me. So I started world building in the most literal definition of, let me put a world together and see how it fits together and make some kind of entertaining narrative that some players might eventually go down. The way I built it was compartmentalized, and I mentioned it on previous episodes, where it's basically 6 or 7 self-contained chapters or arcs that the players go through in whatever order they choose to. After running one, I was like, hey, because I've inadvertently made them self-contained, they're actually kind of a good fit to be a published, in inverted quotes, module. So what I'm getting at is where I am now is partway through writing up what I would consider a chapter in my 3-4 year campaign, but I have found that a lot more difficult than I originally anticipated, and it's gone from, man, I think I'm okay at this, and this was pretty fun and my players enjoyed it, so hey, let's get other people enjoying it too. And then I sit at the keyboard and I'm just like, what the hell am I writing here? What the heck is meant to be coming out of me right now? So I don't know if that's like that transition from something you've done at home to something you might have tried to get published is a similar one, or am I just an idiot.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, when you're writing for something to be published, especially like an adventure, which I just recently did myself, one of the major things that I learned was you have to write as if you're explaining it for another DM. Normally, as a DM, you're usually just explaining things to players. But when you're actually writing it down for something to be published and other people to look at, you have to view it from, okay, this is what the DM is going to specifically need for this section of the adventure or the campaign or the setting. And this is what your players might do, or, oh, here's some good advice. And it's just, there's a whole nother, it's like another part of your brain you have to use when you're writing something compared to when you're running it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that part of my brain, I think I need to train a little bit more. It's very easy for me to adjudicate on the fly, as we mentioned there, like, fluffing DCs or numbers or stats or whatnot. That comes relatively easy to me, and I'm quite comfortable in doing it. And then as soon as I'm having to concrete it on paper and say, no, the DC for this check is 17, I'm immediately second-guessing myself and being like, is that right? 17? Are you sure, Danilo? Are you sure you don't want that to be 15? Or is that kind of, and I have to stop myself from getting a blooming spreadsheet out to work out the margin of, the percent chance of success depending on party stats.
I mean, luckily, like the Dungeon Master's Guide, usually all of those resources online and the books usually have great things like, if you're in this tier, this DC is usually pretty good for what you're expecting. Like, even the Dungeon Master screen that I have actually posted above my computer, it literally just gives you a DC for easy, hard, difficult, very easy. Yeah. And you could just use that as a baseline for, okay, if they're around this, then this might be the ideal DC.
Yes, yeah, the 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30, I think are broadly the numbers for those, You're very easy to almost impossible. So, as I said, I'm halfway through writing that, and it's taken a million times longer, and I am personally struggling with, where do I draw the line between, how many NPCs do I want to put in, and, how many points of interest do I want to put in? Are these just unnecessary noise that gets in the way of the DM running this, or are these vital components that the DM needs to flesh out the world, because the reason they're playing a module like this is because they don't really want to do that?
I would say, in this particular instance, I would say that it's probably best that you include what you feel is absolutely necessary. And then if you feel those NPCs are absolutely necessary, then go ahead and add them. But essentially, like, the best thing about any type of work, like any campaign, any adventure, is that the DM always has the ability to say, no, I don't like that, I'm changing that, or, oh, this will work better for my campaign, or my setting, or maybe this particular deity I have in mind, or I want to introduce this particular NPC that's going to be a reoccurring, so I'm going to use this one instead of that one. The beautiful thing is that don't ever feel like that you're giving them too much information, because of the fact that they can either ignore it or change it.
Okay, that's good advice, and one I'll try and keep in the back of my head when I'm rattling away at the keyboard, churning out potentially garbage. So you mentioned there, perhaps accidentally, but DM's Guild as a platform to publish. Now, again, you've got more experience here. You opened with listing off a couple of the settings, like Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, that kind of stuff. Here's where I'm going to show my naivety, perhaps, and how late I am to the party. In that, I came to D&D and it was 5e, Player's Handbook, DMG, Monster Manual. Okay, fine. Here's my world I'm building. And then when I looked at the rules on DM's Guild, they were quite precise with things you can and can't include. And if you're building a setting, it can't be on DM's Guild, but it can be on something else, depending on the license. And you can homebrew other things as long as they don't include items, or elements from I think it was Spelljammer. And I think I posted it even on Reddit, on the DMs Guild Reddit, and said, guys, I'm really not super comfortable with what these rules are, and the last thing I want is to invest all this time and effort, post it, and it gets taken down tomorrow because I've inadvertently mentioned a spell that is in some archived tome from 3rd edition that is that is taboo to be used on DM's Guild. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts or guidance around that, because honestly they're like, don't use Spelljammer, as if I should know what that is. And I replied being like, I've literally never heard that term before, so how do I know to avoid it?
So luckily it's just like when you're referencing specific things.
Okay.
Now there are tons of places that you could technically publish. I typically use the DM's Guild because I'm usually referencing older editions or direct classes or something of that nature with my own work. So it just makes more sense that I use the licenses that the DM's Guild allows. Like, if I want to make subclasses, DM's Guild makes the most sense for me. But Drive-Thru RPG is a good alternative that has a little bit more relaxed rules relating to that. But essentially, if you're worried that you're going to be like, oh, I'm accidentally including something from Spelljammer, don't worry about it. Spelljammer is like a very, very specific setting. You just can't reference specific names, characters, items, things like that. Like a Spelljammer is just like a spaceship, essentially, in Dungeons and Dragons. So as long as you don't have spaceships named Spelljammers, you can even have spaceships. You just don't call them Spelljammers.
Okay. All right. You've done a lot there to put my mind at ease. So I would consider what I have written not necessarily a setting. There's a city and monsters and a story and a dungeon. But what is the word setting? When it comes to homebrew, what does that really mean? What are the connotations behind the word setting? I feel like it's quite loaded.
Yeah, so a campaign setting is essentially the world that a adventure takes place in. So, for example, right now, most of the adventures, the pre-built adventures that you can purchase from Wizards of the Coast, those are mostly set within the Forgotten Realms settings, which has its own history, deities, lore, continents. Like, it's basically, it's a universe. It's like a narrative universe that the story takes place in. So, one of the things that a lot of people do is that they create nondescript settings. Like, you know, we'll just use my adventure. I wrote an adventure that it is basically just an underground dungeon that you can explore. But I didn't include any specific names or locations. I just said, hey, if you want to throw this dungeon into your setting, it just needs to be at a place with large underground areas available.
Yeah.
And then you could literally input that anywhere, basically.
Okay, so that's the safety net, and that's what I've done because I've seen it done on others. So I've put in, hey, this will work perfect in a mountainous region, and you can just drop it in there, and that's pretty much your get out of jail free card, almost.
Yeah, essentially. As long as you don't reference specific names, you're perfectly fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Hands up. I'm abusing my power as the host to answer some some personal questions, but hey, if I've asked them, then other people have asked them. So that's my excuse. So aside from translating 4th edition to 5th edition, and you've mentioned you've just recently published a module, what other kind of things have you homebrewed, or can you tell us a little bit more about the module that you've just worked on?
Yeah, I could talk about it. Let's see. I have released an entire class that I designed, couple of subclasses. I've also converted some 4th edition spells, and then for my own personal game, I have an entire campaign setting that I've developed.
Okay, so that includes continents and deities and all that stuff. Okay, impressive. One topic I wanted to talk about today was balance. In terms of how do you go about doing that? And I think by your reaction, I gather it's a rather delicate process.
No, I just knew this topic was going to come up at some point. So, balance. It's a very, very tricky thing, and I would not at all claim to be a master of it. There are very, very few people who are, I would say. Mm-hmm. And those people, you should covet them when writing homebrew. You should make absolute best friends with them.
Yeah.
But essentially, the best way to gather balance is information and experience.
Mm.
So I've been homebrewing a very long time, and I feel like I have a good grasp on balance on most things, but I read the Player's Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual. I reread those. Like, if I literally just created some monsters recently, and I literally had the Monster Manual open the entire time, and I was checking it every 2 or 3 minutes. Like, okay, proficiency bonus, challenge rating, hit points, and it's just, honestly, the easiest way to balance, I would say, is literally just take a monster and modify it. Like an existing pre-built monster and modify it. Yeah. But with enough experience, you can then eventually build something from scratch. Mm-hmm. Balance is also... See, that's the thing. Balance is such a hard thing because it depends on what you're aiming for. Like, for me, balance for, like, something I'm publishing, I'm just going to go for a generic balance. Like, okay, the characters are level 7, we're going to aim for challenge ratings somewhere between 6 to 9, depending. Mm-hmm. But for my own campaign, which I have, oh goodness, they're level 10, I have 7 people that I DM for.
Wow.
And they are all equipped with massive amounts of magic items. I'm just like, okay, challenge rating 17, here we go.
Just throwing them at it now.
Yeah, that's another thing about balance that it's not really properly explained. Fully rested characters can take on double to triple their normal CR.
Yep. I think that's a learning process that a lot of DMs have that realization in their own unique way, including myself. That idea of the party going Nova, it's bittersweet in a way. It's nice to see the party just kick ass and take names. But then when you've spent time being Machiavellian in your encounter design and saying, oh, this one is deadly, they better watch out. And then the wizard and the sorcerer just knock off half the HP in a blink of an eye.
I got a slight story for balance, just to give you an idea. Mm-hmm. So, in the campaign that I DM for, there is a Goliath who wanted to be large. And I'm like, okay, sure. You're like 7 feet tall. Okay, congrats. So he's a large character, so he has to squeeze through 5-foot hallways now. And I'm like, okay, I guess that makes sense. And I gave them one of the items that I homebrewed. It's essentially a knife that you can cut a doorway into a solid surface, and then it creates like a 10-foot by 10-foot dimensional room, essentially. Basically, it's kind of like, it's like a safe space, basically. You can't like store items in it because once it closes, it ejects all items. And I'm like, okay, this is just something that they might have some use for. You know, maybe I couldn't see any problems with it. And my players... So the Goliath was like, okay, I want a larger shield. Okay, all right. Also, I want to enchant my boots to be able to fly. Okay, I mean, you certainly have enough gold for that. Yep. So he cut the door into this giant tower shield, had all the other players jump into it, and now he has this flying tower shield where they're just pelting things. They're just shooting through this open door of a shield while the Goliath is flying above. And it's just like, great. So that's something I didn't account for.
Fair play to you. Props to you for being brave enough to keep stacking the bags on the buckaroo of the of the magic item barbarian. I am way too scared and have basically drip fed my players because I'm super paranoid that they're just going to whip the rug out of my feet, which is a failing on my part. Like they should be enabled to do that, and I am getting better and giving them more items, but it's only because I'm so sensitive to that balance just swinging completely in the opposite direction. So how did you like nerf it at all?
Absolutely not. One of my favorite things is being as a dungeon DM is being surprised. Like, my players surprising me is the best part of Dungeons & Dragons for me. And Homebrew definitely allows that. But essentially, the players can use Homebrew as, like, additional leverage and combinations to create and surprise you, which is always the best part. And I never want to punish my players for being creative. Like, just because I gave them a door, like a creatable room, it's my fault that I didn't anticipate them creating essentially a jet fighter, basically, in my campaign.
An F-16, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They're just arrows and daggers and spells just being launched from a tower shield. Like, that's my fault. But I was happy about it. Like, they completely subverted one of my encounters for it. I was totally fine with it. And honestly, it's the best part of Dungeons & Dragons for me is I always love being surprised. And I always love surprising my players.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, I'm a big fan, as I've said previously, of subverting expectations, which is a posh way of saying just surprising them with weird and off-piste approaches to things. And yeah, I'm going to start giving them more items in the new year. We're taking a holiday break, but in the new year, I'm going to start giving them more items, and hopefully will find myself equally surprised. I have to admit, my question to you of did you nerf it or not was absolutely loaded, and congratulations, you gave the correct answer of not nerfing it in post, because that's as I understand a bit of a no-no, and as you said, that's on the DM, right? That they've introduced it, and that's it. They got to live with the consequences.
I could have always, like, after the game, be like, "Hey, I totally didn't expect that. Is there any way that we could, like?" No, but I don't. That's not the way I roll.
No.
Like, oh goodness. I spent about 2 years developing my campaign setting to the point where I could just improv the rest of the campaign. That's literally how I run Dungeons & Dragons. It's just like, here's the setting, go have fun. So, it's hard to be disappointed in your plans if you don't have one.
Your plans can't be spoiled if there are no plans to begin with.
Exactly.
It's an infallible defense. Yeah, I think the only exception is, you know, using the door thing as an example, is if I had made a genuine misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of the rules or something, and the first time I introduce this thing, it works in a certain way, and then afterwards I go, oh man, I was super wrong, then maybe that would be my line to say, hey guys, I made a huge mistake. Can we, going forward, amend it in this way? Then yes. But what I'm getting at is it's not a mistake for players to use items in genius ways. That is not a mistake on anyone's part. That's just the game.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the arrow of mass destruction design that I've seen floating around. So, Bag of Holding is an extra dimensional space where you can put items in, and it carries more than it does. But in order to make it so that it's not overpowered, you essentially can't put a Bag of Holding inside of a Bag of Holding. Otherwise, if you do, the Bag of Holding rips apart and creates like a 10-foot radius that sucks everything into the astral sea. Well, somebody designed an arrowhead, basically, that has a rolled-up portable hull, which is an extra dimensional space, at the end of it. Yeah. And then behind that portable hole is a small open bag of holding. So what happens is that you fire the arrow, and the arrowhead hits something, the small portable hole launches into the bag of holding and triggers the effect.
Yep. So it's like a dimension grenade.
Yes.
That just rips a fabric in reality, and all you're doing is firing an arrow. Wowzers.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely homebrew.
Yeah, to say the least. Yeah. Also, not quite to that extreme, but other people have flinging a folding boat because there's some weird physics that happens when you unfold the folding boat in mid-flight, and its mass changes, and it's suddenly like a catapult, and weird and wonderful things like that. And that's just the ingenuity of humans, I suppose, in trying to find those loopholes. I love that idea of that, the dimension arrow. That I'm going to have to ban my players from listening to this episode.
See, that's the beautiful thing about homebrew, is that if your players want something, like, off the wall, you can absolutely give it to them. Like, one of my players wanted to play a Goliath that was 7 feet tall and a large creature. Easily. Done. Adjusted. One of my players wanted to play a sentient cat. Like, an actual... talking, two-legged walking cat. And I was like, okay, I can design that. That's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
One of my players wanted to be an insect race, like a moth creature, humanoid. And I was able to find that on the DM's Guild, and they were extremely happy about that. One of my... with the 7-foot Goliath, my 7-foot Goliath was an artificer, and he casted large on himself, becoming a giant creature, and he's like, okay, I want to start throwing my teammates. And I'm like, there's nothing in the rule books about that? So, yeah.
You're so far in the Wild West at that point. It's just anything goes.
I love it. It's the best. There's actually a product on the DM's Guild called Yeet about it. And
is that a spell?
No, it's all about the mechanics of tossing creatures and objects, like how far you can throw, and the amount of damage it does based off of its size, basically. Okay. And then there's a bunch of like items and subclasses. But yeah, I picked up the rulebook when my Goliath was like, I want to start throwing characters, and I'm like, okay, give me a week.
Yep. I think throwing other characters comes up surprisingly often.
Yeah, I'm honestly surprised Wizards of the Coast hasn't addressed it yet. And it's like, here's the rules.
There should be a whole chapter because of how frequently it comes up. So you mentioned that you've made a class and a setting. Regarding this, well, actually, the question, it works for both. I was going to say, do you start top down or bottom up? And so by that I mean, do you start with the micro or the macro? Do you start with a vision and then fill it in that way, or do you start with a specific mechanic and kind of work bottom up?
It's kind of generally a mix of both. Like, for my campaign setting, I knew that I wanted advanced ancient technology because I had been playing Breath of the Wild a ton, and I'm like, I love this. I want a D&D setting of that.
Yep.
So I had a general over idea of what I wanted for the world, but I literally started with a city. I just started with one city, and then I basically took that one city and I expanded outwards.
Okay.
And from there, I got a continent. Then I was like, okay, what other ideas do I want for other continents? And then I had a map, and then I started expanding upon that. And by that, I had a setting.
Yeah. Before you knew it, it was a setting made for you. Man, there's something is going on because I literally, before we started recording, was playing Breath of the Wild. I'd started my second playthrough just before Christmas. Because I said, hey, it's been a couple of years now. The game is freaking awesome. It's been long enough that I've forgotten enough of the map that it's going to be a relatively new experience for me. And I'm going to start playing it again. And then here we are. I come on, I'm talking to you. And you're like, hey, have you heard of that game, Breath of the Wild? The controller's still warm downstairs. That's how close. Okay, cool. I'm just trying to think of the way I did it. And to be honest, it's probably in a very similar way. So, as I said before, I've made a number of different chapters or arcs that are relatively self-contained. There's a beginning and a middle and an end to all of them, so they can be kind of modular to a certain extent, but for the game that I'm running, obviously there needed to be a place for them all to be sat in at one time. So it's my own world, geography, as it were, and it may well be essentially something like Forgotten Realms. I don't know, but it's just generic fantasy tropes, but with sometimes goofy modern trappings. So, speaking stones are maybe slightly more common and function a lot more similar to mobile phones, for example, just because I found personally the kind of stiff mechanics of speaking stones a bit too, stiff. Is probably the best way to put it. Like, you cast this spell and it only works like this. I'm like, no, I kind of just want my players to talk to each other. So I kind of just homebrewed that on the fly, I suppose, which is a good point to say. There's improvisation could be considered ad hoc homebrew.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things, which is not a thought that I've had until we've had this discussion.
I mean, yeah, I've had players who've wanted to create their own spells on the fly. I've literally homebrewed a monster mid-fight. Like, because of the large number of players that I have, challenge rating is all based off of, like, well-rested 4 players of a certain level. So I'm like, oh, this monster's getting its butts kicked a little bit heavier than I was expecting. I'm just gonna, without telling my players, secretly double HP. There, done.
Yeah. What's really good is this ties back into what we were saying earlier on about experience, and it's to its fault, I would say, to a certain extent. It's to the framework's fault that a lot comes with experience, DM experience especially, in terms of making those judgment calls on the fly and being like, okay, they're going Nova, but at least I know how to make it still exciting, or make that judgment call of, hey, no, they deserve to be able to stump all over this one because they've had a lot of tough encounters, and maybe this one will be a bit easier. But those things come with an intuition and an experience that you never stop learning, but it's so hard to distill into a useful talk show. Yeah, that intuition.
Yeah, I would definitely say there is just so much that you just gather from experience when it comes to either homebrewing for a product, for a game, or just on the fly, where you literally just be like, okay, with this type of encounter, they've experienced this, so maybe go a little bit easier, or if I want it to be a little bit more grimdark, I could make it harder, or, like, it really depends on, and it ties back into balance, like, what you want. If you wanted to replicate Dark Souls, essentially.
Yep.
And if you just want it to be crushingly hard the entire way through, like, you could just ignore balance up to a certain point, basically.
Yeah, you just crank up the monster HP to the theoretical max, maybe edit the AC a little bit, but that's a good point, actually. One thing I was thinking about earlier on, thinking about monster balance, and my experience of that so far I built one boss monster using action-oriented design from Matt Coville, where you basically give them a mix of reactions, bonus actions, and legendary actions without them necessarily being a CR20 beast from another dimension, just to kind of level out that action economy, which is, of course, hella important and something that maybe isn't emphasized as much as it should be. And if I do say so myself, I surprised myself with how well that was balanced in terms of the fight managed to go the length I wanted it to. It hit all the big notes that I wanted it to hit during the fight, and I was very happy with how that went. And the way I approached that was a mixture of reskinning and looking at the monster manual, like you said yourself you did previously. So, okay, there, what would be an equivalent CR that would make this a hard encounter for them? Okay, it's CR 15 for sake of example. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of CR 15 monsters. What kind of HP and AC are we typically working with in that range? That was my design process for that creature, and that was basically how I did the stats and the HP, the AC, and proficiency bonus and hit modifiers, but basically the three main things. And yeah, that worked out quite all right. I don't know if you have a similar process of designing creatures.
Oh no, yeah, that's exactly the way that you should do it. You should look at examples of what you want to build first, and then basically work your way backwards from that. Like, I feel like that's probably the way that everyone does it, honestly. Like, I don't know people who could just on the fly make balanced monsters like that.
Okay, I must admit the action-oriented thing was necessary, I suppose. In this particular battle, it was mainly one big bad boss, and he had a couple of minions that kind of came and went during the fight. So again, that was a really good time to surprise my players with, oh, he's acting out of turn. Why is he doing that down low? Well, it's because I can, and because he can. But then again, that was a learning experience for them until they are about to fight much harder things that have legendary actions straight out the gate. So they won't be quite as surprised when a dragon sweeps them across the deck at the end of the wizard's turn. And one thing we haven't talked about with kind of design and balance is the items. So I know you transcribed a whole bunch from 4th edition to 5th edition, and also a spell I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I've currently converted quite a few spells from the first player's handbook of 4th edition. There's a grand total of 3 of them in 4th.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a lot of classes in 4th edition. But it's great. One of the things that I am not looking forward to is the psionic classes. That's gonna be very interesting, because it seems like 5th edition is very much not touching psionics, much to my dismay.
Yeah, it's something I see and hear a lot online about people decrying that where are my psionics, and that word is pretty much absent from all the material, right? Unless I'm forgetting something critical, but I'm pretty sure.
I mean, mind flayers kind of have psychic abilities and some other various aberrations and things like that. But, like, the actual concept of psionic abilities, like the battle mind and traditional monks from 4th edition were psionic class.
I'm looking at Tasha's Cauldron has introduced the Psi Warrior for fighters as a subclass. I think that's about as much as we get right now.
The weird thing about psionic, especially within like 4th edition, and which is why a part of why I think that 5th edition hasn't really touched it much, is that psionic classes had the ability to augment their powers, basically. So essentially, it was almost kind of like spell casting with spell slots, but for specific abilities, where you could just use a normal psionic ability, and then you could augment it once or augment it twice, or different number of augments depending on the ability, and it would basically add additional features to that ability.
Okay, that's interesting.
Which I think is hard to convert into 5th edition.
Yeah.
I can imagine it would be possible with something equivalent to like sorcery points with having its own abilities, but you would basically have to create features that are spells but not. Which is why I think they really haven't touched it, because that mechanic, the whole spells but not mechanic, is hard to convert and then mix well with the other materials that have been released, like magic items and class features and multi-classing and things like that.
Yeah, looking at Tasha's now, the source book, the most recently released one, you are right on the money, because it seems the way they've taken it with the Psi Warrior is they have psionic energy die, which is basically a superiority die. So, like you said, a resource that they can spend to modulate a feature which isn't a spell, but could very easily be a spell. And in fact, their signature ability is basically casting the telekinesis spell for free. So, yeah, that looks about as close as we're going to get to there. Unless, of course, you enter the marvelous world of Homebrew, and I'm sure the online publishing tools are full of psionic goodness.
Oh yeah, there's tons of homebrew psionic classes on the DM's Guild. Yeah, they're pretty decent. I haven't really found a way to introduce them myself because none of my players have actually asked for it. So, but yeah, I'm willing to bet they're working on it.
Yeah, back in the depths of the wizard's office, some poor guy is just he's in the psionics office and it's just him.
I don't envy that task.
No, I bet. But bringing in those things is tricky in your own settings because then it sets a precedent, and it's also awkward if they haven't seen a psionic for the first. They've gone halfway around the world and haven't seen a psionic, and then suddenly, oh yeah, he's just a psionic. Wow, okay, he's incredibly rare. Nah, it makes it difficult to kind of retcon them into the universe. And yes, homebrew in your own setting can be whatever you want it to be, and this, that, and the other. But I pride myself, to be honest, on trying to keep the setting and the universe congruent. It makes sense, and those kind of jarring gear changes can really get the players asking questions that are very difficult to answer.
No, I absolutely hear you. Like, when I first created my my personal setting for my my D&D group, there were tons of, like, races and such and subclass options that weren't even available, and I'm like, okay, if my players wanted to introduce these, how would I explain that?
Yeah.
It's like, that's the problem with creating a setting. It's just like, you could create a setting, but new content's gonna just keep rolling out.
Yeah, that's what I found. In fact, one of my players wanted to be a Warforged in a fairly, as I said, a fairly standard fantasy, in quotes, setting. So that's obviously begs a lot of questions of, are there other automatons that aren't sentient, and what do people think of them, and so on and so on, and where are all the rest, and should they be as prolific as other races, and so on and so on, which is not really set outside of Eberron as a setting.
See, my homebrew brain is already thought of a way to introduce that. That's just like that's just experience. Just like make it so he's an intelligent shield guardian. He's a modified intelligent shield guardian. That's it. You don't have to call him a Warforged.
Yeah. On paper, but in game, it can be whatever you want. And I have a very, very, very good, if I do say so myself, longer term plan that will reveal a lot of his past, shall we say, to keep things delightfully ambiguous as to my intentions. But yeah, a lot of the modular arcs that I mentioned are in some way related to the character backstories, and one in particular is related to that Warforged backstory, and will reveal a lot more of, and answer a lot more of those questions of where he's come from and why he is the way he is, and why there aren't a million Warforged wandering around, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, in terms of the items and spells, more predominantly the items, but in fact it goes the same for spells, of not balance per se, but more setting the rarity and setting the spell level. Is that, do we have any guidance on that, or is it literally a case of doing what we do for monsters and, okay, what does a 4th level spell look like damage wise, and how much damage do I want my spell to look like? What kind of rarity does this item have, and how powerful is it? Okay, geez, my item's going to be legendary.
So, with magic items, I would say it is a little bit trickier. Luckily, there are some information available. Like, typically, there's the 4 major tiers of Dungeons & Dragons. So, luckily, you could just divide it into Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4. So, magic item plus 1, magic item plus 2, magic item plus 3.
Yeah.
You can roughly approximate what an item's rarity would be based off those tier levels, and say, like, for example, a wand of fireballs, for example. So you know that wizards get that particular spell, I think, It's a 3rd level spell, so I want to
so.
say around 7th?
It might be slightly earlier than that.
So essentially, we know that tier 1 ends around 5th level or so. So we know that uncommon magic items would be within around tier 1. So we would say, okay, Wand of Fireballs would be around rare then.
Yeah.
So essentially you would just basically assume based off of like what abilities it gives, what character levels it's trying to emulate. And then of course there are magic items where you have no earthly idea how in the world you would want to put a rarity on that.
Yeah.
One of the ones that I can immediately recall that I homebrew was the Ring of Personal Gravity. And what it did is just once per day for 1 minute, you just point your finger in the direction, and that direction is your new down direction for gravity.
Your relative gravity relative to you, yeah.
Your personal gravity is whatever direction you point for 1 minute. And I'm like, I mean, like how I don't know how you would rarity that, because this is like it's levitation, it's pseudo flying, but if you point, like I even point out in the product itself a joke of pointing up while outside, you would fall up for 1 minute and then fall down for 1 minute. Just like there's all sorts of just like all crazy stuff like that, and even rarity itself doesn't take it into consideration balance. Like most flying items, like a Broom of Flying is, I believe, a rare item.
Yeah.
Either rare or very rare. Now, Broom of Flying does have its own limitations, of course, like it can't carry much. But giving a character the ability to fly, there's a reason it's dreaded within campaigns, because it does break quite a bit. Now, granted, there's numerous ways of countering it, so it's not that big of a deal. But a rare item that gives you flight, it's hard to quantify rarity with balance in that case.
Yeah, it's those, with the monsters, it's easier, and I know why you say that, and it's because there are numbers to guide you. There's the CR system, there's HP, there's AC. Okay, I know roughly the banding there. But with abstract benefits, then you can't judge that. Like, how do you put a benefit on walking on the ceiling for a minute? Well, I don't know, the spider climb, is that that's, just, it works in some situations but not others. You need a surface, whereas your personal gravity thing doesn't. And how can you really draw the line there? And I guess it all comes back down to that experience. But what might be rare in one setting might be mundane in another setting, and you might have arcane universities where they double the floor space because half the students are walking on the ceiling. Which a trademark, because that sounds like a really dope
that does
setting.
Actually that does sound really cool.
You should have like a proper Harry Potter style school with like one class on the ceiling, one class on the floor, and people walking on the underside of steps and stuff, and you've just doubled the capacity of the school by installing these kind of personal gravity shifters. Yeah, trademark. Nobody steal that, or I'll charge you.
There are actually wizard colleges in my campaign setting. Like, for each of the wizard colleges, there's actually a university for each of those colleges. And I'm like, that's a great transmutation college feature.
There you go.
But no,
consider that a freebie.
That's all yours. That's all yours. No worries.
Thank you. Yes, £50, please. Or, well, $80. So I haven't done many items yet. A player wants me to put together a magically mundane item. So by that I mean there's no magic to it, but it is completely homebrew. Just because it's not magical doesn't mean it's common, because he's having to build it. So therefore I'm having to build it. So there's implicitly a level of rarity there, despite the item being unusual, I suppose. So that's one piece of homework for me over the holiday period, is to have a think about how that is gonna work. And the Warforged that I mentioned earlier on, he's actually a druid, which is a little bit of a thematic it's very clear thematic in his head. There's a very good aesthetic that he's going for there, slightly unusual. And he suggested a great idea of when he does a long rest outside or in the wilderness or basically in contact with nature, he should get some kind of bonus or benefit. Likewise, when he spends it in a cave or a bedroom or a metal lab, he might have a drawback because he's distanced from nature. And I was like, that is good. I've just got to think really quite hard on how to ensure there's a good banding on the benefit and the drawback, because I don't want to give him something that he gets maybe on 4 out of 5 long rests that puts him at an advantage over the rest of the players. But then also I don't want to make the drawback make him not have fun to play the class anymore. So I'm a bit anxious, I'll admit, of trying to design that. I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Oh, no, yeah, I immediately had thoughts. Like, it doesn't even have to be an extremely complicated system. It could just be small personal benefits. Like, let's say if you spend a long rest in a mountainous area, you just get +1 to your AC. If you spend long rest in a grassy area, you get an advantage on your nature checks. Like, that's not that great of a benefit, but it is useful.
I really like the idea of flavoring it to the terrain. I hadn't thought of that, and that's a really nice way of mixing it up.
Yeah, and the downsides don't even have to be that punishing. It could just be like, if you spend a long rest in a city, you wake up feeling groggy, like you're just not as connected to nature. So maybe you have, like, disadvantage on persuasion checks for a number of hours. Or, like, if you spend it in, like, an alternate plane of existence, like maybe like the Shadowfell or something, then you could get maybe something a little bit more severe in that instance, where it's like an extreme environment.
Yeah.
Where you could give like disadvantage on spell attacks for something like that. Or it doesn't even have to be that complicated. It's just like environment, benefit, and it doesn't even have to be a supreme benefit. It just has to be something that just slightly modifies their gameplay depending on where they're sleeping.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. That's really good food for thought. And I'm now just rattling through the different biomes in my head and thinking, ooh, coastal. What could I do for coastal?
I would say give them advantage on athletic checks to swim.
Yeah, I was going along the lines of something to do with swimming or swimming speed or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I'm my own worst enemy and tend to intimidate myself into fearing it's a larger unit of work than perhaps it necessarily is. And that's, I gather, a drawback of being creative. It's a form of writer's block, I suppose. I
would always say, like, no matter what you're homebrewing, bringing it to another person for a second opinion is always the best. I mean, I do that for my own work all the time. Like, I have other DMs that I play for, and I bring it to them, and even if I don't agree with their opinion, or they suggest something even far better, it doesn't matter, because ultimately, the more people you have exposed to that work, the more it is likely to be balanced.
Yeah, the more refined it gets, you knock off the sharp edges.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, food for thought, and hopefully aspiring words for people such as myself out there who might be thinking about throwing some ideas together. And I'm always open to providing feedback and my opinion on items and weapons and spells and whatnot. Is there anything you wanted to cover specifically? Anything we might have missed?
We could always talk about how absolutely easy it is to make subclasses.
Oh, hey, do you know what? Hit me with that, because if I'm scared to do a very trivial class feature, then subclasses are like, whoa.
So subclasses, I would say, are by far the easiest thing to homebrew.
Wow, okay.
Because of the fact that most subclasses have a formula to them. So usually how it works is that there's a primary feature that you want to focus on. So let's say the Echo Fighter, the one that they introduced for based off of the Tottori campaign setting, where basically you just create a copy of yourself, basically.
Yeah.
So that's your primary feature right there. Then, from there, you have ribbons, which are basically not combat-oriented additional features that are useful. Like, say, because you have an Echo, you're used to seeing through two sets of eyes, so you get, like, advantage on wisdom perception checks. Boom. Ribbon. Something useful. Then you just build off of that primary ability. And then most subclasses have their own formula. Like, they all typically follow some sort of formula where it goes, they have their primary feature, there's a secondary ribbon, a secondary feature, something that builds on top of the primary, and it basically, all subclasses follow that formula.
Yeah.
And then, like, damage output, like, if you want to say, this subclass has, I don't know, can fire energy blasts, let's say, why not? And you know it gets it at this level. You just treat it like a spell. You say, okay, what's a spell equivalent to this level? Okay, it does this amount of damage. You're casting this spell as a feature, basically.
Yeah, it's that feature spell mirroring that we were talking about earlier on.
Yeah, I could write subclasses all day. They are quite easily the simplest thing. Now, building a class, that is much, much harder.
Okay. Is that purely just because you're basically tripling the work because you've got all the other levels in between the subclass levels? Or is there more to it?
Not only that, but you're the one who's designing that formula. And not only that, but you also have to have a general concept that the class embodies. And then subclasses that build on top of that primary concept. So, for example, the one that I created was the host, which is basically you're a half monster, basically. Where you're tanky, you have lots of constitution, you're good at defending allies because you're good at having these high constitutions and drawing attention, basically. So you build off those different ideas. So there's like being a fast tank, a damage tank, a high AC tank. You can teleport, different types of ideas that help you build the general idea of being tanky, basically. And all of the classes work off that general concept, where wizards have lots of spells and utility, so they build off of specializing within a specific utility. Fighters are good at combat and have those subclasses that build off of either expanding their combat abilities or dealing additional damage. Paladins are good all around, where they're high tanks and very defensive, so they have auras, which makes it so that you're good around being other allies, smites, various channel divinities that are good in certain circumstances, usually in response to something. But that's how all classes are built, are based off of a primary concept, and the subclasses build on top of that, basically.
Yeah, I saw a post recently that was criticizing, and I can't remember for the life of me which subclasses it was, but it was basically saying one of the subclasses they didn't really like that much because it wasn't doing that a lot. It was almost, standalone. It didn't really build on the primary features of the class, and then they compared it to a couple of others that have really take the class in a new direction while still keeping it thematically in the same arena, which is, I think, really, 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 really good advice from yourself that you've just given us there, of taking that core thread, that core ribbon, and trying to spiral it out into a new direction. And you've put it very well on why that makes subclasses a lot easier, because you've got that core framework there, and you're just putting a flavour on it, a spin on it.
Yeah, exactly.
And all that's left is the numbers. And as we've discussed before, rip those numbers from other features at a similar level, and you're halfway there.
Yeah, exactly.
Champion. I think that pretty much brings us to the end of today's episode on Homebrew. Is there anything you would like to plug?
Yeah, sure. As previously mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, I am available on Twitter at Mr. Bakudan. You can find my products on the DM's Guild. Just search my name, Kyle Wagner-Totty, or Kyle Totty, or Kyle Wagner. Either is fine. And those are the primary resources that I'm on. I'm also on Discord. If you can find me and reach me, feel free to do so.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks again so much for coming on. I feel like we've had a couple of really interesting discussions there about the trials and tribulations of homebrew, both at the table and away from the table. So I really appreciate your input.
No, it was a pleasure speaking to you.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for listening at home. You can find me on Twitter at Danilo_DND. Please drop me a message with any comments or interesting homebrew ideas, or maybe any thoughts on the Warforged Druid feature we were talking about earlier on. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and good night.
Take care.